Hey everybody, it's Mr. Baker again. Hope you're doing well. This is our second lesson on the development of the American West, and I want to kind of review a few things before we move on and break this quote down and kind of see what you all think about it. And just really quick from before, guys, remember we just a real quick review. We did a quick unpacking of the settlement of the West, and we focused our attention on things like push factors and pull factors. Okay, probably the biggest three pull factors are going to be the Homestead Act that gave land to settlers to be able to move out west and become farmers and use the land for their own purposes. You're going to have the Pacific Railway Act that eventually is going to, really kind of start to invest more federal government money and capital and also land that they owned into building a railroad. All right, and then thirdly, but by no means lastly, but for sure, is that you're going to have a big focus on the idea of expanding education to meet some of the needs of some of the developments that are going on. The Morrill Land Grant Act. So, guys, imagine all these different universities and colleges that are going to be geared toward, the agricultural sciences and maths and engineering and technology. Okay. And guys, the one thing to keep in mind that we did not hit on a lot in our last session is how does technology adjust to the West? Okay. So obviously the railroad is an example of that moving forward, but think about things like the picture that we looked at last time where you've got really very little by the way of things like wood and, certainly, trees to be able to make fencing. So barbed wire fencing, guys, if you've ever driven down the road and you're like, man, I'm noticing barbed wire. A lot of you guys are like, well, Home Depot's down the road. People today can go and get the lumber that they need, at least a lot of times. But guys, back then you got to remember that is not the reality of living in the plains or on the frontier. Okay. So therefore, you got to get creative, right, with how you use sod to build homes. It's a very similar kind of thing. And so Joseph Glidden, who's going to be an inventor, is actually going to become very resourceful. And he's going to say, well, if we maybe have enough, let's say, wood, if we're lucky to make fence posts, we still got to have something to actually put in around them to actually be able to keep things like horses and cattle. All right. And the result of that is barbed wire. Okay. And there is a downside of this, guys. There's a concept that people call the open range. Okay. And it's pretty much the way that it sounds. Okay. So all the land that has no boundaries to it, right? So in other words, no fences. Those of you that like to live in the country without having a lot of, things like that, that appeals to people. But guys, what happens when you start to see these plots of land being kind of like confined to fences and things, the open range concept is going to change, right? And the question I want y'all guys to think about is, what are the consequences of that? Okay. Are the consequences going to be more positive or are they going to be more negative? Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that you're going to continue to see, guys, the development of different forms of the steel plow. Okay. Now, I know a lot of you guys are like, well, Mr. Baker, earlier on when we talked about the first industrial revolution, you already gave us a little bit of background on John Deere. Excuse me. Had to think there for a second, guys. And you mentioned that the steel plow was kind of like his claim to fame, which is true. All right. The one thing, guys, to keep in mind is that, when you're getting into soil that's rocky and soil that's clay-like and different kinds of soil, then what is going to be a really good thing to do is you're going to be like, well, let's create different kinds of plows. Ergo, you're going to see, guys, that as a changing piece of technology. Okay. And guys, a lot of you might be wondering, well, why do these land grant colleges and universities become so important? Okay. And the quick answer to that is because, guys, remember, colleges are areas where there's a lot of ideas. There's a lot of, like in the modern day, especially a lot of professors that are there to study and certainly, do laboratory sciences and things like that. And so they're trying to build upon where our society is technologically, et cetera. And that's going to be why we continue to see this. Now, with that being said, pause your screen and reflect on this particular quote. So where did we leave off last time? So we have this railroad that's eventually going to connect the country from coast to coast, right? All right. So from sea to shining sea, etc. All right. The map on the next slide will make this a little bit more clear. Okay. So the saying here, guys, this is a quote that someone made. The Transcontinental Railroad changed the United States geographically, culturally, and demographically. Okay. Now that's a very loaded statement. Okay. So if I were you guys, I would take just a moment, kind of like a little warm up, if you will. If you're in class today, you'll be obviously doing this together. We'll be working through it as a group. Okay. But geographically would mean, how is the landscape going to look different? Right? Because you're laying all these railroad tracks. All right. How is it going to affect, maybe can you build a railroad right smack dab through, obviously, a mountain? No. Right? I mean, you're going to have to do some changing of the landscape and things like that. Okay. How are people going to be affected? That could be also cultural. Okay. So guys, think about this political cartoon. So it's kind of hard to see this, but this gentleman is most likely a Chinaman, right? Or at least a Chinese American. All right. So again, somebody who was very involved in a lot of numbers with building the railroad. This is probably a foreman. Okay. Maybe an Irishman, right? Who maybe was a little bit more proficient in the English language when he first came over. And then, who is this? A Native American chief, most likely. Okay. And guys, think about like what this part of the political cartoon represents. Okay. So these are going to be the interests of big business. Okay. So guys, remember, the railroad, as we'll look at more in a second, does become really what a lot of historians consider to be the first big business in the United States. Okay. And if you think about it, that's a pretty strong statement to be made because it's a very essential piece of the economic puzzle. Okay. And so that's kind of a quick analysis of something to think about. Okay. So those of you that are familiar with time zones, right? A lot of you guys are familiar with, East Coast time, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Okay. Especially if you've traveled, ever throughout the country. But guys, if you take a look at all these, you'll notice a couple of things. These cities that you see that are actually larger scale cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, Denver. I'm focusing mainly on Midwestern and Western cities here, guys. Salt Lake City. Okay. Even if the map here doesn't show it, if you were to go into some parts of Kansas, like Abilene, etc., you'll notice, guys, all these different cities are towns. Those are going to be developing a lot of important things because, guys, remember this cattle industry that's going to be developing, the ranching industry. Guys, where does a lot of the ranching start, right, or get emphasized? It's going to be parts of Texas. Okay. Now, I know that everybody's not really a big fan of sports and college sports and things like that, but for those of you that have ever heard of the Texas Longhorns, guys, if you've ever seen a Longhorn cow, right, or cattle, that's pretty much what we're talking about. And so those cattle are a lot of times going to be driven from parts of Texas into some of the areas that are close to these more northern railroad tracks. Okay. And so they called those little towns sometimes cow towns, and they actually called these drives. If you're in class today, you'll see the map, guys. I'll show it to you. Okay. But anyway, you've got a lot of these little trails that these, regulators, I think they were called, would use or whatever. Okay. And they would actually do that. And so you notice, like Promontory Point, which is about right there, that's going to be where officially the Transcontinental Road gets finished. Okay. So as you can see here, it does connect the country together. Now, if you take a look here, guys, you'll notice that when you're looking at all these areas that are kind of in the reddish, okay, you'll notice here, guys, primary federal land grants, to railroads. That was the Pacific Land Grant Act that we were Railway Act, that we talked about last time briefly. You're looking, guys, at all this land that these companies are getting from the federal government. Okay. The question that I have for you all guys to think about is, do you think that this is a federal responsibility? Because this is a lot of money, right? I mean, these canals that we talked about last couple of months ago with like the Erie Canal, and that's the one that probably stands out the most to me. Some of the other ones over here, I mean, those are expensive. But guys, when you're talking about a massive project, I mean, internal improvement, okay, as we call it, this is not something that just takes a little bit of time. I mean, this is a work that takes time. It's like if you think about, guys, eventually the development of this big highway system, that eventually is a big vision of Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s, okay, you'll notice that this is a very similar kind of thing, right? So again, something to ponder, to ask yourself, okay? So we don't have a lot of slides today. We have 3 more. But I want us guys to think about today about the effects, excuse me, of the development of railroads, especially on the farmer. Okay, you can pause this if you want to, and then listen to what we're talking about here. A lot of this is also in your readings. But guys, if you think about it, what did we say about the farmer before? He's going to become extremely reliant. Okay. And we say extremely reliant, guys. Keep this in mind. Are we talking about the idea of, these farmers wanting to? Well, I don't know if it's really an option for most of them. Okay. Because, guys, remember, if you can open up additional markets to sell your goods, right? You live, let's say, in New York, you're a dairy farmer, right? Which would be, you're selling things like cheese and milk and all those things. Okay. And you know that you can get your goods across the country and have more people buy them. Okay. You're going to become pretty reliant on the railroad, probably in most cases, whether or not you want to be. Okay. So a couple of things to keep in mind, and I'm going to explain more about the rebate on the next slide. So just keep that in mind, is that the rebate is not popular by a lot of these farmers. Okay. And a lot of you guys, if you've ever heard of rebate before, I'll just point this out really quickly. A lot of times if you buy something in a store, there's occasionally, you'll get like a little mail-in rebate where you mail in, a rebate coupon, and a few months later or whatever it is, you get back $10 or $20 or whatever it might be. Okay. That is similar to this. But the difference is, guys, is that these rebates in a lot of cases were not going to these farmers. They were going to favored customers. Now, I want you to think, guys, what would be meant by the term favored customer? Okay. And we haven't really talked about this extensively, but just to kind of give you a little bit of food for thought for our next couple of weeks. For a lot of these big businesses like railroads, okay, and others too, their favored customers are going to be other big business leaders in other big business categories. So, for example, if you're a gentleman by the name of Andrew Carnegie, who's going to use a lot of the railroad for his steel industry, guys, somebody like, Stanford, or even somebody like Vanderbilt or someone like that, right? They would say to you, okay, we're going to give you a special low rate. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, farmers are going to be upset about that because they're not going to have the exact same perk. Okay. Then you throw into it, guys, the high tariffs. Okay. This is where, guys, having an understanding of earlier in the year kind of builds upon itself. Okay. So this is not a new issue. Farmers, especially in the South, have been very, very opposed to the tariff on imports. This is the same basic thing. Okay. Because arguably their goods at this point in time are not going to be able to compete as well as, let's say, things that don't have a shelf life. So if later on, if there's a car coming over from, let's say, somewhere like Japan, and let's say we're American-made cars, you could say, well, maybe the tariff on those goods is better, but the farmers are not seeing that with benefiting them. Okay. And then also, guys, because of higher production, because of technology to an extent, you're seeing lower crop prices. Demand is high. All right. I'm sorry. Supply is high. Demand is lower, ergo price is going to adjust. Okay? And so therefore, guys, if you're a farmer, right? I mean, imagine you sell bushels of corn, wheat, all right, gallons of milk, whatever it might be, whatever the volumes are. Okay? The lower those volumes are in cost or price, the less money you're going to have to actually pay for your farm, pay for your home. You know, probably not as many people back then sending their kids to college and everything. But imagine guys moving into the modern day, how that becomes a larger trend, right? These people are struggling to survive. Okay. And so they're going to be like, okay, we need to affect the monetary policy. Okay. Now, this term, guys, for those of you that are actually using Mr. Baker's course guide, this term is actually defined in your course packs. And monetary policy is kind of a fancy way of saying it's the amount of money that government puts into circulation. Okay. So that could be like they're coining silver, they're coining gold. All right. Later on, that would be a little bit, you start to hear more, guys, about the idea of inflationary paper money, etc. Okay. And so what these farmers want is they want more money in circulation. Reason being, the more money in circulation, the higher the prices are going to be, right? So they're going to be able to see the benefit of that. Okay. That's the reason why bimetallism. Now, guys, think about the term metal, meaning something of resource, which is going to be things like silver and gold. Okay. And also bi would be having two metals that you're going to use to actually back your currency. Okay. So if you're putting more of this into circulation, then the farmers are going to be more content. Okay. And so a lot of you guys are wondering, well, Mr. Baker, I see that bimetallism is kind of important, but I also see this free silver movement. Okay. Well, guys, I'm going to show you a real quick map again. So if you've ever heard of mining industry, like there's a lot of mining, guys, that starts to happen like in parts of Nevada, parts of California, etc. And guys, what they start to discover is they found this humongous discovery of silver. Okay, it was called the Comstock lode. Okay, and so I mean, you're talking, I think at the end of the day, it was worth, I want to say it was like $400 million of gold and also mostly silver. Okay, and so these farmers, guys, are like, well, let's coin all of it. All right. And they don't exactly get their way, but we'll look at that more in a second. And so what are we noticing, guys? The farmers are wanting the government to look at things from their perspective, right? Okay. And so what happens? Well, government does act, okay? At least a little bit, okay? And so this might be a good place to stop again. And so government is going to pass an important act in 1887 that's called the Interstate Commerce Act. By the way, when we get to what's called the Progressive Era, this will pop up again, guys. So again, things are building upon themselves. And this is going to create, guys, the first regulatory commission in American history. Okay? And a lot of you guys might be wondering, well, Mr. Baker, what is a regulatory commission? Okay? Well, first of all, think about what a commission is. A commission is a group. Okay? So it's a group of people, maybe it's, 10 people, 11. And guys, think about the value of having people, right? You have people that are talking about these issues. And at the end of the day, what is their ultimate goal? To regulate. In this case, guys, think about what interstate commerce means. We're talking about trade, basically within the states. Okay? And so therefore, guys, what do we notice? That you have a lot of things that eventually are added as regulatory agencies. I won't say a lot about this because of time, but if those of you are familiar with the FCC, Federal Communication Commission, and that comes around a little bit later. What do they regulate? They regulate things like the use of radio, the use of television, the idea of censorship, internet as well. And guys, another thing that you find later on is that even like this is down the line as in the 1970s, but your parents probably remember this depending on their age, but there's a big nuclear disaster that happened in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and 3 Mile Island is what it was called. And so as a result, President Carter decided to create what was called the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, I believe it was called, or commission, excuse me. And their big thing, guys, with that is to explore why that event happened. Okay. So regulatory agencies are going to become a lot more common as things move on. Now, what is this agency designed to do? Well, first of all, take a look at the big thing. Railroad rates must be made public. Okay. So in other words, what does that mean? It means that when you walk into a railroad station, okay, today that would be you walk into a restaurant to buy something, you walk into a store to buy something, guys, those prices are right there for public information. Okay. And so that's pretty much the way that it sounds. Okay. So there's no trickery, right? Doesn't matter whether you're, let's say a middle class farmer like Mr. Baker could be, or let's say you're somebody like John D. Rockefeller, who was one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest men in the United States back then, developing anyway in this time period. Okay. You're going to be basically paying the same rate to use a railroad. Okay. Ergo, no rebates. It is then illegal, okay, according to this law, to actually say, all right, you know what? I'm going to give a special rate to Mr. Rockefeller, but not to Dustin Baker, the farmer. Okay. Now, I want you all guys to think, is that a good thing, or do you think that they're overdoing that? Because, guys, there are things that companies try to do to try to draw customers in, like buying in bulk using, if you've been to a place like Walmart or especially Sam's Club or something like that, or BJ's or Costco, right? That is a way that they try to get people in, right? So they're giving them some degree of perk. You use my product more, you have a lower price on it. Okay. So point is that there's a lot of debate here. And the other question, guys, to keep in mind is that these acts are only as good as the enforcement. Okay. And the problem with this, guys, is that the enforcement is not going to be really strong. Okay. And a lot of you guys might be scratching your heads wondering, well, Mr. Baker, why? And the quick answer to this is because government is not enforcing these laws, because government, guys, is heavily, heavily influenced by big business. Okay. All right. So what can the farmer do? Last couple of slides. Okay. Well, first of all, he can sulk. He can say, oh my goodness, this is bad. Railroads are kind of putting us out of business, so to speak, or whatever. Or the farmer can actually try to do something about it. Ergo, guys, what does the farmer do? He tries to become political. Think about what that means. Now, probably the most common thing, guys, that we're going to look at in a second is the Populist Party movement. We'll look at that more on the next slide. But guys, think about it like this. Is the farmer better off if he or she or they are individualized with their representation, or if they're basically more unified? Okay? And the argument is that if they're more unified, okay, they're going to be in a position to be able to have strength in numbers, as the saying goes. Ergo, it's going to become a really big thing for these farmers to create what are called farmers' alliances. Okay. Now, this is one example. Okay. But guys, think about this. You're going to have national ones. You're going to have regional. Regional meaning, there was a Southern Farmers Alliance. There was a Western one, I believe it was, North, Midwest, etc. Okay. The National Farmers Alliance, the way I see that, guys, Doesn't matter whether you're a tobacco farmer in North Carolina, whether you're a corn farmer in Nebraska, whether you're, let's say, a dairy farmer in upstate New York or something, okay, or whether or not you're a rancher that makes your living off of livestock in Texas, okay. Basically, guys, you are trying to come together to promote a cause, which is, railroads need to be regulated. We need to have government looking after the best interests of everyone, not just a select group of people. That is minimally effective. Ergo, they're like, you know what? We need to even become more united within the government itself. They, guys, check this out. They even formed their own political party. Okay? And I'll end with this. This is not the entire platform, but it's about 5 major details. Okay? And I promise you this is the last thing, but very important. Okay? So, guys, as you can see here, there's going to be several elections where the populists nominate candidates for president, but they never won a presidential candidacy. All right. But they did well in one election, which is the one that we'll talk about in 1896. Okay. But in the 1880s, the populists are like, okay, we need to now more formally organize by party. Okay. So they create a platform. Okay. So, guys, think about what that is. What is a platform? If you're building something with a platform, it's something that is sound, that basically has things that you can support, let's say weight or whatever. Well, the platform is kind of like stances. Okay. Where do they stand on things like money? Where do they stand on things like income taxes? Where do they stand on, let's say, government becoming more involved? All right. So take a look here. So the first 2 things are more related to money and circulation. Okay. And this is monetary policy. So my question, guys, to all of you is, what do they want to do with monetary policy? Do they want to increase it or do they want to decrease it? They want to increase it. That is correct. With the intention that prices are going to go up and they're going to be able to have success with, raising, keeping their farms, paying their debts, mortgages, etc. Okay. And I will tell you this. They wanted unlimited. They do not get it. But there are going to be some acts that were passed in Congress that we won't worry too much, guys, for the sake of time, but something to keep in the back of our minds that do actually increase the amount of money in circulation, but it is not unlimited. All right. So I think one of them was the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. If I recall, I think it was that one. I think there was a ratio, guys, like for every 16 ounces of silver, I believe, that they mined, that they would actually, I think, phase like 1 out of every 16 ounces or something like that into currency or monetary policy. Okay. So it works, but it's not exactly to the liking of the populace. Okay. Here's my question next. Progressive income tax. Now, a lot of you guys are like, well, Mr. Baker, I know that right now federal income tax is constitutional. It is because of an amendment, actually. All right. But this is where the populist guys want there to be an even playing field as far as wealth. All right. Because the argument is that, okay, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but something guys land your plane on. What is an income tax if it is flat? That means pretty much, let's say you're somebody like John D. Rockefeller. I know I've referenced him a couple of times. He was worth, I think at the time the stock market crashed in 1929, he was worth, I think it was like $2.3 billion in that day's currency. Easily the richest man in the world today, if we convert his currency by 2020 monetary comparison. Okay. And so let's pretend that, he has to pay 10% of his money. And let's say Mr. Baker, who's a struggling farmer, has to do the same thing. The argument is, guys, is that is not really a just system of taxation when it comes to this. Progressive income tax is a system where the more money that you're making, the higher tax bracket you're going to be in. Okay. We also call that graduated. Okay. So kind of a way to look at that, guys, the more money you're making, you're graduating into a higher tax bracket, all right, as they call it. If you're in class, we'll talk about the pros and cons with that. All right. But it's something to keep in mind. Government ownership of some key industries. Okay. Now think about the one big business that they're going to want to have the government with their hands in more. Yeah, it's going to be the railroads. Later on, that could be anything, guys, related to communication, from things like telegraphs to telephones to even internets, connections down the line, cell phone towers, in the modern day, for those of us that are obviously cell phone people, which most of us are. Okay. And so what would be the advantage, guys, of having government ownership? Well, if you're looking at it, guys, from the standpoint of the populist, there's a lot of trust in government here. Okay. So the argument here is, guys, is that most likely these populists, progressives later on, are thinking, okay, there's things about government doing things that they have a lot more trust and, shall we say, a lot of positive thoughts about, okay, than, let's say, the big business leaders and the capitalists. Okay. I'm not saying that's good or bad. Lean your plan on that for yourself, but that's going to be what they argue. All right. So let the government own the railroads. And then last but not least, the 8-hour workday. Okay. Now, I want you guys to think each one of these four things the farmer wanted even before the Populist Party came about. Okay. And guys, I've only done farming one day in my life, but I can tell you that one day taught me some things about farming. One, respect the farmers out there. They got a tough job to do. But more importantly, beyond that, I learned, guys, that farming was not an 8-hour a day, 9 to 5 job. You're looking at probably 12 hours, 14, depending on conditions. So why would you put in an 8-hour workday? Right. To draw in a different set of interests. Guys, who is wanting an 8-hour workday? All right, the farmer can't have it, right? You're not going to see, guys, a farmer that is going to be very successful probably managing that. Maybe if he has some help and stuff, it's going to be the factory workers in the North especially. Okay, so what the populists are trying to do is they're trying to draw in. Okay, so they have a couple of candidates, 1890, 1892. James B. Weaver, who, by the way, was a Civil War veteran, advocates this platform. He does get some support, but it's not the amount that he needs to win. And then 1896 rolls around, which is considered by many historians and political scientists to be one of the first modern elections. Okay. Now, the populists are going to be represented in this election, but this is actually pretty important, guys. This person right there, William Jennings Bryan, excuse me. All right. That's actually a pretty young picture of him. He's probably 36 there. He actually was a very young candidate in 1896. I think he was 36 when he ran for office that year. Keep in mind, you have to be 35 to run for president. So he's pretty young compared to the candidates that we've seen. And he makes the Cross of Gold speech, which is kind of like his, shall we say, historical claim to fame at this point in time. And guys, the Democratic Party is going to be like, you know what, we like this platform. They actually formally nominate William Jennings Bryan. Okay. And we don't have time to read the speech. Maybe we will if we have time in class. But guys, for the most part, he advocates a platform very similar. Okay. And does not win that election, but he puts a lot of these ideas on the map. Now, I'm going to end with this, but in a few weeks, we'll come back to this. So one of the common questions, guys, that we get about political parties, third parties, political groups, etc., is their platform successful? Okay. And this is kind of an interesting one, guys, with the Populist Party, because they weren't elected president. They do have some congressional positions, and even I think it was a couple of state governorships, but they did not win the presidency. I would argue, however, okay, that the Populist Party, and this kind of goes along with the last point here, guys, that the Populist Party is successful in its own way. And here's a reason why. Many of these ideas up there, progressive income tax is still with us, even though down the line it has to be added to the Constitution. Okay? Government does regulate some industry more, right? And we do eventually have support for an 8-hour workday. If you've ever heard of the idea of overtime pay, time and a half. Now, this is not until 1940 at the federal level, but you have an act that was passed under FDR's New Deal, which we'll study next quarter, guys, quite extensively. That is going to really make it clear that, you've got a minimum wage, you've got an 8-hour workday, pay people beyond that, right? Okay. And so here's my point, guys. The party itself by name might be phased out by, let's say, 1900 or so. But the principle of government having a responsibility to do more to look after our society, that is a big picture idea that the Populist Party is going to pass the torch to the progressives. Okay? And if you're kind of wondering what is a progressive, we'll come back to that, but that's a very important thing. Okay? Guys, I hope this helped with understanding the furthering of the West and the importance of the railroad and the farmer interests that are further developing and how their political interests are going to be furthered. So feel free to email me at bakerd@franklinecompany.org if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will look forward to seeing you our next time when we start to dive into the rise of big business. Take care and stay safe. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.